Hello everyone, I'm Ulrich Obrist and I'm so delighted to welcome you to this special event, which is part of the SOTHEBY'S talk series organized together with Intelligence Squared. Today we're going to be talking about the conservation of cultural heritage, exploring how new purpose and meaning can be brought to old structures so as to bring them back to life rather than just restoring bricks and mortar. And we will be focusing in particular on a perfect, amazing example on how these priorities have been woven together to preserve an extraordinary cultural treasure for generations to come, namely the 15th century Franciscan monastery on Lopud, one of the lofty islands of the coast of Dubrovnik in Croatia, a project I was lucky to visit early on in the process with Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza, whose vision this project is, and Francesca is actually joining us from Lopud itself. Francesca is an arts patron, a philanthropist, and of course the founder and chair of TBA 21, which focuses on commissioning artists, architects, scientists, writers, thinkers, and doers to focus on achieving peace with nature and ourselves through the lens of arts. It made me think actually of something Alexis Pauline Gumbs recently said in a conversation. We have the opportunity now as a species, fully in touch with each other, to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. And this idea of unlearning and relearning patterns of thinking is of course also very, very important in relation to the theme today. Francesca is also the creative director of Lopud 1483, the restored Franciscan monastery, as mentioned, on the Croatian island of Lopud. A very warm welcome to Francesca.
Thanks, Ulrich. It's great to join you virtually. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of days. That's even better.
Same here. And in Basel, we have Olafur Eliasson, artist, internationally renowned for works, groundbreaking works, including the Weather Project in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, the Serpentine Pavilion, together with Ketty Thorsen, the New York City waterfalls along the Manhattan and Brooklyn shorelines in New York. And more recently, we're going to hear about that as well today from Olafur, an incredible installation in Rian live at the Baylor Foundation. A very warm welcome, Olafur.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Francesca, for having me here. It's very exciting. I look forward to learn a lot here because I'm stuck here in the present. I'm not very good at the past. I'm also hopefully going to be relevant in the future, but I'm so excited about learning today.
Thank you, Olafur. And in New York, we have Bénédicte Montlaur, who is joining us. Bénédicte is president and CEO of the World Monuments Fund, a very important organization dedicated to the preservation of historic architecture and cultural heritage sites, many, many sites around the world. A very warm welcome, Bénédicte.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. Thank you for this great opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to talk about this great place, Lopud, where an amazing work has been achieved, and also to talk about how, in fact, cultural heritage preservation is not about the past, but also about the present and the future.
We're now going to start the conversation, and I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask our three speakers why cultural heritage matters, and start actually with a question to Bénédicte, then to Francesca, then to Olafur. Bénédicte, can you tell us about what the World Monument Fund is doing to raise globally awareness of cultural heritage at risk?
Well, so what we do is that we partner with individuals and communities all around the world to save their heritage at risk. Heritage is so important because it's humanity's collective memory. And I think we realize, we take it for granted, we live around it, it shapes our identities, but we really realize how much it matters when it's at risk, when it's endangered. I think we all remember the feeling of loss we felt when Notre Dame was on fire, or when we learned that the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas in Bamiyan. So what we do is that through our main program, The Watch, we encourage nominations from individuals or organizations all over the world who want to raise awareness about heritage places of historic significance, but also where they think that we can create a project together or that they need support for that would have a contemporary social impact, that could really transform the lives of people around those sites. So every 2 years, we receive those nominations from all around the world. We select 25 projects that are the most meaningful, and then we adapt to the local needs, sometimes just by putting those sites on the list. This really increases the visibility of the site and help mobilize people around the site without having to intervene very strongly from our side. Sometimes, on the opposite, we go there, we bring international expertise, we create a local team, and together we preserve the place, but also we look for local meaning and local relevance. So I think Lopud is a great example of what we can achieve in terms of advocacy through the watch. In fact, what's interesting is that Lopud was on the first watch list of 1996. So for us, it was also an experiment of what we could achieve through that program. And it was really fabulous to see that just by putting this monastery on the watch, we had such an enthusiasm that because we showed that, you know, not only it was important historically, but there were so many economic opportunity, especially in this post-conflict situation around cultural heritage preservation. And it was wonderful to see that Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza took over this project and carried it. World Monuments Fund was just involved at this very initial phase of the project to raise awareness about it.
Thank you. And actually, you also said that the important thing is to raise awareness whether or not your organization is involved in the restoration. Can you maybe tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, there are so many places in need, and also so many places that present incredible opportunities, economic opportunities to create jobs, but also to tackle some of the most important issues of today. Some sites need to be elevated just because they highlight the diversity of the communities. Some sites help us address some subjects, like for instance, we are working on a water body system in India, where this will help us address the water crisis in India partly. So there are so many sites, and of course us at World Monuments Fund, we carry out field projects. At the moment we have around 50 field projects. But what's more important is to have local individuals or communities taking it over, understanding the opportunity around their own heritage, creating meaningful projects around them, and guaranteeing its long-term sustainability. So this action of advocacy and raising awareness is in fact the most important part of our action.
Thank you very much, Bénédicte. And now, of course, we want to hear more about Lopud. We thought actually today is really about learning, as Olafur said. We could maybe say learning from Lopud. And Francesca, I wanted to ask you to tell us, because Lopud is such an outstanding example of an individual coming to the rescue of a place under threat. Can you tell us about how it all began? How did Lopud enter your life?
Well, I was, before becoming an art collector for the last 20 years, I ran a non-profit organization called ART, which stood for Art Restoration for Cultural Heritage. And I did that out of the Villa Favorita in Lugano, where I was working as a part-time curator in my father's museum. And Marilyn Perry, who was one of the founders of and I think believe still on the board of the World Monuments Fund, was on my board. And I was immensely influenced by the World Monuments Fund. And I was sort of intrigued by their passion for restoring and the restoration of old buildings. I made a quick study at the Arts Institute in New York for a while to study under Marco Grassi. And I watched a lot of conservation projects happening in the museum, mainly of works of art and paintings that were in the collection. And it was something that really drove me for quite a long time. And at that moment, the war in Yugoslavia broke out, and the invasion of Croatia began by the Serb forces. And at the same time, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina in particular. And I believed at the time that, you know, cultural heritage actually really does represent, very importantly, past inhabitants of areas. When ethnic cleansing is happening, heritage plays an important role. I think we all cried when the Sarajevo library was bombed, and many of its most precious manuscripts that represented a tolerant society between many different religions existing together in an area. So that was the end of this era, and I organized a conference about art at war in Zagreb. Together with the Institute of Protection of Monuments, I visited many frontline positions. I was a bit of a war veteran at that time, taking tremendous risks myself. And I ended up coming to Dubrovnik just in 92, which was just shortly after its siege and final bombing by the Serb Navy. And much of the city was still on fire, and the surrounding areas were still occupied. And there was an incredible group of gold grain paintings that were hidden from the shelling in a basement underneath the bishop's palace in Dubrovnik. And sadly, that was pretty much at sea level. And many of those paintings were being damaged just by the conditions in which they had been hurriedly packed away. So we managed to take those out, and I set up a conservation lab, the first conservation lab in Dubrovnik, together with some restorers that came from the region that had been trained in Zagreb. And the Franciscan monastery in Dubrovnik gave us a space in which this lab could be set up. And I worked together with Giovanni Marusic from the Getty Conservation Institute and Stefano Scarpelli from the Uffizi in Florence. And we set up this project to restore these works, but also a training program so that they developed this expertise of working on these early Renaissance paintings, which are now thankfully all back in their places in the churches and in the various museums around Dubrovnik. And this was a project that lasted 10 years, and in the process of which I had regular lunches in the refectory of the monastery in Dubrovnik with the friars. And Pio Mario, who was then the elder, said to me one day, "Have you ever been to Lopud?" And I was like, "Where is Lopud?" So he managed to convince a fisherman friend of his. Most of the boats in the harbor had been destroyed with the shelling of Dubrovnik. And we managed to take 2.5 hours to get out here. And as you know, many times the journey to get somewhere is most of what it is when you arrive. And as we turned the corner of this incredible island, my eyes set on the fortification walls, the huge fortification walls around Lopud, 1483, and I fell in love. And that was maybe 25 years ago. That was, this is a more recent photograph with all the roofs fixed, but actually at the time, you know, most of the roofs were broken down. The sky could be seen from the ground floor. It had been abused and abandoned for over 100 years. As the monks were less and less, and actually the conditions out in this monastery are quite tough, especially 50% of the year. Lopud is cut off from the mainland with storms in the winters that defy imagination. And as I entered the building, I felt this incredible presence of, you know, there's some buildings that get deconsecrated, and as I entered this entrance room that you see here, it was full of fishing boats, and as you can see, the ceiling had been lost and destroyed, and the next image shows you what it looks like now. These two angels used to be at the entrance of the Villa Favorita Museum, and this beautiful relief from the 15th century of the Virgin and Child also, because this is called the cave of the Virgin Mary, and it's dedicated to the birth of Virgin Mary. And I decided to put this relief in the entrance because it's very symbolic of what this actual monastery represented. So as you can see, here's the cloister in its state of disrepair. And this is a huge cloister that actually collected water from the massive roofs to enough water for hundreds of people. So this building was actually the shelter for the whole population of the island of Lopud. And here now you see this beautiful cloister as it stands today as a place of reflection and reading. It's also where I hide my fishing rods. But you know, this is very much attention went into preserving the patina, as you can see. And this is actually the room I'm sitting in now, and I think you can see behind me the graffiti on the wall. That is actually a testimony of this monastery's modern history. It's written El Duce. Il Duce was a nickname for Mussolini, and the Mussolini troops landed in this part of Croatia, of course, in the 1940s, early 1940s. And I think that this was a very difficult part of Croatia's history with fascism. And of course, the Conservation Institute wanted this absolutely to be removed. And this is the question when you get into the conservation of a building and not its restoration. You preserve its original patina, and you actually preserve all of the multi-layers of that building's history. And so I actually brought Frank Gehry here quite early in the beginning. I hadn't even begun work. I had seduced him to come to Dubrovnik to visit the earliest synagogue, the Safavid synagogue in Dubrovnik. And we came out here in a local police boat, and he looked at this and he said, Francesca, take your time. Get to know this building. Let this building speak to you. And I was like, no, I'll get it all done. In about 2 years, it'll all be finished. I've got all the plans. I know what to do. And he looked at me and he said, let the building reach out to you. And it took me a few years to understand what he was saying. And I actually am happy to tell him on this weekend when I see him with you, Hans, at the opening of the Luma Foundation in Aal, how incredible his advice was for me. Because now this is the room, you see the desk that I'm sitting at. I'm facing this original plastered wall. I'm looking at a Patricia Tribb painting on the right. On the wall on the left now there's some Joan Jonas drawings that she gave Marcus and I for when she performed her performance at the Prado Marcus, moving off the land, sorry. And you can see them behind me on the wall. So I think that a lot of was a discovery of all the different layers of history. And there are many, many parts of this building which we still don't know or understand. Here is the corridor as I found it. It was actually quite dangerous to walk along it. I think very few of us took the risk of crossing these floorboards. And next picture, you can see exactly the same view with tremendous amount of furniture that I brought over from the Villa Favorita in Lugano. This was furniture that I inherited from my father that has been drifting in storage for decades after the closure of the Villa Favorita in Switzerland. And you know, it was really an incredible opportunity to bring some of this Gothic furniture into this amazing building. This led me to discovery of this space that had once cleared from all the debris of the roof that had collapsed onto it. We just realized that this is a cistern and a fireplace. So this is where the monks, who have a huge tradition in pharmaceuticals, and they, in fact, the Franciscan monastery founded its pharmacy in the dates in 1317, and since then has been operating this pharmacy ever since. And we've now restored the pharmacy, but also the practice, because having started collecting some of the original manuscripts from the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries of botany, it became very clear to me that this monastery not only served as a fortress to protect the civilian population, which was quite a large one at the time. It was around 4,000 people. Now it's down to 200. but this island were huge shipbuilders, and there's a huge history in shipbuilding here for the Spanish armadas, and therefore this island was very frequently attacked. So having a hospital inside the monastery was a very big priority. So here you see this pharmacy, which really sort of then triggered my interest in botany and the medicinal properties of plants, which then informed the further practice of restoring the gardens and discovering and making connections to old recipes of old medicinal properties of plants and trying to create a botanical garden outside. This is where I used to work before, at the Villa Favorita in Lugano, this extraordinary villa and where my father's collection used to be seen. And this dining room table is now in the monastery. It's a 16th century table of early Renaissance and from northern Germany. And now you see this table and the original chairs, plus there was that carpet, plus Franco Maria Preti, which is not a bad replacement for the two canalettas that used to be on each end of this table, this magnificent table. The chandeliers on the table are the same, the chairs in the background, some of the orfèvrerie from Augsburg in the vitrines in the back. So I sort of recreated this world of the Villa Favorita that I had lost. And here in the corridor of linking the two buildings, you see the painting on your right, which is a portrait of Anna Dürer, the wife of Dürer, the artist. And in the next page, you see this painting installed in this living room, together with this 15th century tapestry. And the 15th century tapestry, which is incredible, well-preserved image of a French king in his botanical garden, actually reprimanding one of his gardeners for doing obviously some terrible crime, surrounded by his attendants. But what you see all around him is these incredible collection of plants. And this sort of sparked my imagination. So you see, I've been drawing from so many different references what then was to happen, and then is to look at the garden and the incredible. We planted something like 66 different varieties of plants. We continue to them grow as we study more what the gardens the potential of the gardens. And I just want to maybe stop here because I could go on for ages. But this history, this relationship with this area and the relationship with the Franciscans, which I think is so important. He lived in the 12th century, as many of you know, and was probably the most charismatic figure in all of the history of Christianity. And he came from a very wealthy background, but his message was modesty and poverty, but also the connection and the respect of all natural and living beings and entities. So to me, he was also one of the original conservationists. And so as you can see, there is a garden full of herbs and full of it's very structured and organized in the way Renaissance gardens were. And it also has 9 extraordinary meditation spots designed by a shaman that I've been working with for 10 years called Asa Anderson. And these different locations throughout the garden offer people a refuge and a place to relax. As we travel across the island, and we go to a central part of the island, which is also a part of the garden that I also restored. It's an olive grove. And that will lead us from the monastery to your Black Horizon.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And actually, of course, we spoke earlier today about the importance for you with this project to actually bring life to buildings, not just their roofs, and basically by drawing also from history, from local traditions, and of course by opening up this space of healing. And we're going to talk about that with you later, but I think it's, as you suggest, a great moment to bring in Olafur. Olafur, it would be great to hear about the art pavilion you created actually together with David Adjaye, Your Black Horizon. It was initially shown, I remember, in 2005 in Venice at the Biennale, where we actually all together spoke at the conference, and then in 2007 moved to Lopud. It was in Venice, it was on the island of San Lazzo degli Armeni, and then moved to Lopud in 2007. It would be great if you can tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project, the collaboration with David and Francesca.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Francesca, to share in such great detail the history. Many of the, even though I've been to the island right at the beginning and also later again, this was very touching actually. See, now I was interested in light. So the Black Horizon actually all started with light. Francesca and I had in Iceland experienced a horizon line that I made in a space, and she came to me with this notion of, what about recording a day, 24 hours of light, as I'd done in Iceland, in Venice, because wasn't Venice really about that whole canaletto, the history of how light was not just about science, but it was about how we shape the world and ourselves and so on and so forth. What I think in that whole Venice situation, we were at the, the whole thing with Venice is the question, and as an artist, I think that's always interesting. Are people coming to travel back in time and meet something where they say, oh, this is really old, my God, this is how they lived, and this is how, or is Venice actually traveling up to meet us where we are today? Is Venice contemporary? And of course, this question to a large extent comes from, how do we experience things in museums? And we often tend to objectify or solidify. We might even go as far as saying this is a timeless design. And we also hear words conservation and preservation and heritage. There's an element of sort of stopping things, and the opposite would be. And I know this is not what we're talking about now, but for many people, they think they step into the museum and suddenly time is not an issue anymore. It's just like kind of quality for eternity. And throughout my generation, the last 20, 30, 40 years, there has been this shift where we say, well, the past is not objective. The reality we're in today is also not just one reality. It's many realities. It's many truths. There's many pasts, there's many futures. And it's not to say that everything is relativism and everything is highly subjective. It's more about acknowledging the fact that things are relative to the context and the content you're dealing with. And in that way, I mean, this is something we, of course, have discussed in many different ways. The idea of the Black Horizon came about the process of the quality of the white light during the day, from the earliest morning where the sun rises, which is red or pink or somehow purple, and then all the different types of white light that you have during the day, the kind of bluish to the cloudy, then there was a thundercloud, then there was again a bit of sunshine, then the sun started setting and it becomes very orange and it becomes very soft and darker in a sense. It was a recording we did with a nanospectric device for science. And together with David Adjaye, who was very interested in finding out how do we host a horizon? How do we create a space in which a horizon is actually the host? Normally we would think of ourselves at the center, as the center of the world, and the horizon is what is furthest away. But could we turn it around and say, this is where the horizon lives? This is where you go in, and because it is absolutely dark inside of the pavilion, I'm sure you have some pictures you can maybe show inside the pavilion. It's absolutely dark, and there's just this one line of light. And we do play, I believe, we play the, how should I say, we play the whole 12 hours of daylight. We play that in, I think it's like 6 minutes or 8 minutes or something like this. So you hear the camera maybe over amplify the bluish tone of this. But what is maybe more important, it's actually quite hard to tell how far away is this that you're looking at, because it's completely black in there and you just see this one line. Is it a hole in the building through which you're looking to the outside, or what is it actually seeing? So there is a bit of a, how should I say, negotiation. There's a sort of a, am I seeing something 10 meters away or 2 meters away? Should I be careful not to bump into the wall? Is this actually something I can touch? And this notion of negotiating as you go, this notion of, well, I have been given the responsibility to constitute my own horizon. I am actually been put in a place where they think, whoever has created this thing here, they think I'm smart enough to actually make up my own mind about what is my own horizon. And of course, the interesting thing for me is that there is never a moment which is the same. The light keeps changes. I mean, when it goes in a loop, so it becomes the same again. And this is, I think, an indication of what I thought was particularly inspiring with Francesca's story before. This notion of everything is on the move, nothing stands still. Everything is, how should I say, there are no nouns. Everything is verbs. You know, there is nothing which doesn't have a trajectory, doesn't have an agenda, or it doesn't have intentionality. And it is with the understanding of that, just like when you are in an art museum, you actually find out that there is also room for people in that idea.
And of course, thank you, Olafur. That's exactly what you did in Rien near Basel now. But before we talk about that, I have one more question about the pavilion, because before I visited, I always sort of thought it was the monastery and the pavilion, and I actually realized being there that the pavilion connects deeply to the landscape, and that almost creates a kind of a counterbalance to the monastery. Can you talk about that?
Well, I was very interested in this notion of the monastery has not stopped traveling. The monastery is on the move. You know, maybe when it was left to sleep, being not renovated, and but in a way, I think it's fair to say that the vibrancy or the resonating quality of the monastery has made it a contemporary. You know, you could also say it's been traveling for how long? 500,000 years now, and we are meeting up with the monastery today, and that meeting up, I think your Black Horizon was to a certain extent a celebration of this notion of presence, and this is. We tend, especially in the westernized world, to think that we, the excellent people, the people of excellence, we are the ones who are moving, and the rest of the world is standing still. Just when the colonialists, the Spaniards moved to Mexico, they said, "Oh, Mexico is standing still," and the Spaniards were traveling. That was actually not the case. Mexico was on the move as well, and it was a meeting up, which went very bad for the Mexicans. But this notion of primarily the sort of conventional white Western idea that we can conquer, we can take over, we can colonize, we can sort of take it in. I was interested in how do we leave that notion and acknowledge that it is a lot more complex, and there's a lot of need to how should I say. I use the word decolonize with carefulness because I'm a white old guy, but I think there is a great need to somehow reframe the fact that the macho or the sort of patriarchic or the paternalistic, all these things has kind of driven into a strangely centralized vision, where the relationship for me, a strangely centralized vision, where everything is around me, the modern progress, more success tomorrow, more and more is in front of me. And what I actually forget is simply to look around or to look down, look at the earth on which I'm standing. So the dialogue in Lopud, as you asked, so I'm sorry to give you such a convoluted answer, Hans, but it was this coming together of something that had almost been sent from the future. And I never really say that because I don't want, because people immediately then start to, oh, the future, that it gets really complicated. But it's someone traveling from the past, and that is the cloister, the monastery, and something who's almost as if it is a thought, it's a concept, it's an idea which has not really yet been born, like a horizon, right? We are looking at the horizon, we are seeing what is about to come to us. And so the meeting up, and I spoke with that with David and Jay, how do we host the presence? And as a small anecdotal detail, everyone knows that feeling where we say, okay, the horizon, inside the horizon is everything we know. Outside of the horizon is everything we don't know. And as history evolves, the horizon sort of expands, right? But if we walk up to the horizon, like you can do in the pavilion, it turns out the horizon is not a line that you can sort of push. It's actually a space. There's lots of space inside the horizon. And who lives in there? Uncertainty, negotiations, undecided matter. But it may be art, the hesitations there, and you're testing, experimenting. So there's plenty of space inside the horizon, which is a really, I think, quite poetic idea. And being on Lopud as an island, being surrounded by this horizon, I think what Francesca, in a sense, is pushing for is to actually allow for a lot of renegotiation, reconsideration, retelling stories, or untelling stories for that matter. And essentially, I wouldn't call it liberating the building as if there was a certain truth inside that was locked up, but maybe it's more like a kind of synchronizing the building with a set of values that can be applied onto times as they changed. And it's leaving these more dogmatic interpretations of what is good heritage and what is good conservation and what is behind, and offering a much more dynamic, like we heard in the beginning so interestingly from the World Monuments Fund, this notion of a much more dynamic participant or an agent or stakeholder in today's world.
Thank you, Olafur. And that actually brings it back to Francesca. But before that, maybe we can hear a little bit about how you actually approach the architecture of the Biola Foundation in Basel, because you're now in Basel, in Rien, and the project is ongoing. And that, of course, is not an answer to an old building. It's more what Walter Benjamin said. It's a building from the just past, from the very recent past, the Renzo Piano building. And you created an experience which is unprecedented, really, because you basically opened the museum to the outside. Lina Bobardi once said the outsides are in the inside, the insides are on the outside. And that's what's happening here. You also flooded half of the Biola Foundation. Can you tell us about this experiment?
I was incredibly excited about being offered the opportunity to show at the Biola Foundation. Famously, the building is actually inspired by the great building by Renzo Piano in Houston called the Menil Foundation, or the Menil Museum. And the Menil Museum, I would like to think that Renzo Piano was inspired by Philip Johnson, Philip Johnson, who did the private estate of the Menils. And it was very progressive, lots of glass and so on. And this was, one should not forget, this was at the time where there was the new glass house, the Farnsworth house. It was well after the Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion, but there was this notion of, is the glass actually a democratization of, letting the outside in? Lina Bobardi, as you said, there was lots of discourses. And only up in the 90s, Richard Sennett brought our attention to the fact, well, he said, maybe the glass is a social boundary. Maybe the glass in front of a shopping window, in front of a Gucci store, is actually more showing the distance between the inside and outside, and the social distance, because I can't afford it. And this notion of glass also became an issue in museology and in museum questions. Is the glass, in fact, a time capsule preventing the contemporary dialogue with which has a much more embodied of maybe a piece of Chinese porcelain? So the role of vitrines of glass, the whole museum is one big vitrine, and all the way from Philip Johnson and across architecture history also has a lot with a certain question about what is the political standing as when it comes to the passing of time. And on top of that, we live in a world where evidently standing still is not going to solve the climate crisis. And there's a lot of questions that is needed there. And I won't go into that now. But essentially, what I called Renzo Piano, who only 2 days ago actually came to see the exhibition, and he took his shoes off and walked through the water. I have a wonderful picture of him doing that. But I called Renzo Piano and said, Mr. Piano, I actually would very much like to ask you if I can remove the facade. Because the museum, they were very supportive, and they said, well, you better call Renzo Piano. And Renzo was, well, he was a little surprised that I asked, but he was like, well, you know, if the museum is up for it, why not? And what the intention was in fact to go all the way with regards to the transparency that the glass seems to elude. He said, no, the transparency is not really there. It becomes a shopping window. So what you see in this picture, actually on the left, normally is one very, very large glass facade. There's a little pond outside. There's several very famous Monet paintings hanging right on that wall you see on that little white piece there on the left. Of the lily pond of Monet's garden, and this little pond in front of here, which is green because I dyed it green, it has lilies normally, right? So I raised the water level of the lily pond as much as I could. On the right side, you can see I'm only a few centimeters below the edge, and that was enough to bring about 8 or 10 centimeters water into the whole museum. Of course, we put a little membrane, and as you can imagine, we protected the museum by that standard. And then I created a pathway through which you walk, and you are essentially, you know, walking through a exhibition of the outside invited inside. Not at least also the species, the environment, the plants. There's lots of plants in collaboration with Günther Vogt, the landscape architect. We made, you know, a whole principle about. And that will be my last comment on that, but because it brings us back to Lopud. Maybe, as Francesca said, 75 years ago, the Human Rights Charter was made by UN, and the values that was born out of that cannot be appreciated enough. But what happened to the Rights Charter for plants and species? For the plant, for the commons, right? For the ocean, for the sky. And there are rules, you know, there are like a certain rule about how much pollutants you can have in the air. There are rules here and there, right? But it's not what we call rights of personhood. And now we see a younger generation. You know, Greta Thunberg is a lot younger, but even just like a little bit younger than me, suddenly we have this question, well, maybe trees, like the mountains, our mountains in New Zealand, the mountains have rights of personhood. The river Ganga had rights of personhood. And then the government overturned it because that's rubbish. But we must understand that we are living at times where there is an enormous shift, enormous. And there's a kind of a recalibration of values. We are not just going to be human rights driven. We're going to be plants rights, species rights, commons rights, and the environment, and all of that. Evidently, the humans are going to play a significant role. But at the current architecture biennial by Hashim Shakis, I have in collaboration with a larger team from various fields of social science and justice, made a pavilion which is called the General Assembly of the Future Assembly, which is about imagining. Think of the UN, the General Assembly. Imagine if every plant, every species, everything also has a seat. I mean, it's like, evidently, it's not about how to do it. That's another problem. But the question is, are we humans really so self-evidently the ones to sit there alone and just decide over everything else? And these are, of course, slightly controversial questions, but what I think happens when you take a building like the monastery in Lopud and you give it agency in a contemporary world, and just like we heard at the beginning, it brings so much energy up to today, acknowledging that building traveled several hundred years, several world wars to come to meet us. I just spent 50 years until I finally got and saw the finished building. That's nothing. 50 years is like kind of the building has been traveling much longer than I. And this meeting up of trajectories, I think, is such a beautiful idea, which offers a kind of different hospitality also when it comes to meeting up with plants, with species, meeting up with the extinction of insects, for instance. So there's so much going on right now.
Thank you so much, Olafur. And of course, what you say resonates also so deeply with writers like Emanuele Coccia or Stefano Mancuso, no? What they say about plants, but it also goes back actually to many, many centuries back to St. Francis. It goes back to Hildegard von Bingen. And that, of course, brings us to this long durational dimension, both Francesca and you spoke about. And it's something Roman Kaczarnik puts out in his new book, actually emphasizes how to be a good ancestor. And he says we need to actually liberate the world from this short-termism, no, of event culture, and think about more long-durational format. And of course, the monastery on the move you have been describing, and we've been listening to Francesca's long-durational journey with it, has to do a lot with that. And that brings us back to Francesca. I wanted to ask you to tell us more about Lopud 1483, because it is actually open now for special stays and events, and it's inspired by a philosophy so that it isn't becoming a crowded space, but it is actually a space of peace, of serenity, and it is inspired by St. Francis. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I always say that St. Francis was one of the original environmentalists. His passion for all living sentient beings was such a focus. And what this monastery offers is this retreat possibility and the possibility of healing, not only inner healing through its meditational practice, that then obviously the practice of the monks before serenity and so on, but also looking at rebuilding or renewing our relationship with nature. So that has been a very big priority for us.
One last point, Francesca, is because Olafur talked about the pavilion, and the pavilion has now been listed as a cultural heritage on the island. And that has, of course, created such a fascinating dialogue also with the local, with sailors and actually people from the sea. It's in that sense a catalyst. There is also going to be a festival, actually, with the founder of the Sarajevo Film Festival. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's really relevant to hear more.
Well, I mean, one of the biggest focuses was to not only restore the buildings, bricks and mortar, as you said at the beginning, Ulrich, but also to revive it, to give it life again. And it is a place where I've been coming, and many of you artists and colleagues from TBA21 have spent these Lopud seminars here, where for 12 years, TBA21, we just finished one last week, actually. So where we challenge ourselves in our practice, and this year was really focused on the art of healing and how a place can heal, and all we need to do is receive that place and step back and to allow the place to become a place of healing without turning it into a spa area. And you know, much of our history is connected to our relationship with nature, and this is a place where very strongly you reconnect with nature. And the film festival was an idea of a friend of mine, Tilda, who's on the island, and she's very good friends with the founder of the Sarajevo Film Festival. And in fact, I've forgotten his name now, the director of the film The Artist, this incredible movie. I've now lost my note where I wrote his name down. But
yeah, you told me about Pavel Pawlikowski.
Yes, exactly, who made a series. So they will be showing his films in the fortress and opening it to the public in the gardens and the fortress and the cloister, and of course the pharmacy, which is such an important, vital part of this trajectory that I've woven back together again, is open to the public. So it's also bringing these historical monuments back to life and give them a different purpose, because obviously there are not really enough monks to go around to populate the many, many, many Franciscan monasteries that were built up and down this coast. And not to forget, St. Francis himself visited this part of the world in the 13th century. And so it's really on his way to Syria, for that matter. So there is so much about the history that we've woven together to create something of contemporary culture, very focused on renewal and restoration of our soul and our spirit, as well as our relationship with nature.
Thank you, Francesca. And that, of course, leads us to also the question of local communities, no? And Bénédicte, that's something which is very important in your work, how you actually help local communities. And in my conversations with Edouard Glissant and Mantia Diawara, we discussed a lot how one can be local, rooted in one context, but do that in a way that does not lead to the exclusion of other people's roots. It doesn't lead to the hierarchization or election of some roots over others. As Edouard Glissant says, we need to celebrate roots, local roots that expand elsewhere, roots that touch each other. They are not singular roots. They are roots that cover, that protect some other, and that seems to have a lot to do with many of the projects you're working on. Can you tell us more?
Thank you so much, Ulrich, for quoting Edouard Glissant, who is one of my favorite authors, and I think who is also so important today as we are trying to navigate this articulation between local and global. And you're right, this is exactly what we are trying to do. We think heritage belongs to humanity, is our shared inheritance, but we think also heritage can be a living heritage only if it's really anchored in the local and it's the very history of the place and its community. And I was so inspired by everything we've just heard from Francesca and from Olafur, because, you know, heritage is not only monuments from the 16th century, it's also modernist buildings by Renzo Piano, and it's also sometimes immaterial heritage. You know, we are working, for instance, on the stories of the leaders of the civil rights in Alabama. So heritage goes throughout history, but what's important is to take the marvel, the architectural marvel created by humanity, places where a lot of things happen, and to think about it and think about its meaning today for the local people living here and for us. So that was, I think, Lopud is such a perfect example of a successful heritage project, because it starts with very careful study of the history of the place and of its different aspects. The botanical aspect of Lopud is so interesting. And then you build out of it. And that's where preservation is not about stopping things. It's about continuation. It's about merger between the past, the present, and the future. And this is exactly what I think Olafur said too. So yes, around the world, we are trying to bring the best, like the highest standard of conservation, while always being anchored in the local. So most of the time, we work with local individuals, local groups, to make sure it's meaningful and that it has a purpose. So for instance, in Croatia, the whole point, I think, was also to participate in healing this country after the terrible wars. And this is something we are continuing. In fact, we've been working since the 80s in post-conflict reconstruction, trying really to use heritage project as an asset to strengthen communities shattered by war. So after the Balkans, we've worked a lot in Cambodia. We are still present at Angkor with an incredible team. We've been training people that are leading now our projects there. And most recently, we've been extremely involved in the Middle East. Because the Middle East has suffered so much. And I'm happy, like Francesca was just mentioning Syria, but the Middle East is really the birthplace of civilization, has incredible heritage, as we all know, and has suffered now a decade of conflict. And we think a heritage project there can really play an important role. So World Monuments Fund is extremely active at the moment in Iraq, but we are also leading an incredible project in Yemen. And I think that there are some resonance, some connection with what we've just heard about Croatia, because I mean, watching the pictures that Francesca just showed, you cannot remember that Croatia was shattered by war, and look at what has been achieved there. So this gives us a lot of hope for the future. So at the moment, we are active in Yemen, and this is a pretty extraordinary project, because no one can go to Yemen, no international or very few, because this country is living one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. At the moment, for those of us who were lucky enough to go there, this is one of the countries with the most extraordinary heritage in the world. Here you're seeing the Imam Palace with the traditional architecture of Yemen. And it's located in Taiz, which is the third city of Yemen, which used to be in the 13th and 14th century the capital of the Rasulids dynasty. So it has also amazing mosques and other places. And most recently, it was really at the heart of the fight during the civil war between the Houthi and the government forces. And these buildings that you're seeing is very symbolic in Taiz because it is the Imam Palace. So it was a siege of the government when this city was the capital. And it was bombed in 2016 by the Houthi. So what we've been doing is that we've been working with local groups and with the ministry in Yemen, training local preservationists. So what we've done is that we've trained people in Cairo and in Kuwait, and they brought back those techniques and they restored this place. And what's important is that it was a museum. It's going still to be a museum, but at the moment we are also working on guidelines for the whole of the old city of Taiz to see and to see how we can help restore those places, but also find a new use for the community. I think the important thing is always this merger of respecting the past, and I think that has been evoked a lot today, like this idea of respect, of balance between the present, the past, our environment, the natural environment, but also the built environment and us human. So studying the past and seeing how we can reinvent it. So at the moment we are working on those guidelines also for the old city of Taiz, still with our local partners, to see how this heritage work, how these amazing buildings can be an asset for the local community, can give them pride and hope and opportunities back to rebuild their country. So this is a project we're very excited about. But I think these projects, both in Croatia and now in Yemen, which is really at the other end of the spectrum because it's still very much in conflict and suffering, how heritage can really create opportunities for people if you're doing it in a very genuine manner. If you're really assessing the conditions, studying the history, and engaging the community. In all our projects, we do a lot of community engagement to understand from people what this heritage means for us, what they want to use it for, and how it would be useful for them and for their children.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bénédicte. And there could not be a better conclusion because it deeply connects what you said to, of course, what Francesca and Olafur also presented. And the other day, I spoke with Eliasson, the wonderful poet and artist who is now in her mid-90s, and she said how important it is to listen. And I think that idea of listening also to untold narratives, as Olafur said earlier today, to liberate also untold narratives is, of course, so important in all these projects. Many thanks to Francesca, to Olafur, to Bénédicte for your brilliant contributions to today's event, to Sotheby's and Intelligence Square for putting it all together. I hope you all enjoyed watching and thank you all for joining us. Thank you.